Why it sucked living in medieval times. Life in the Middle Ages is often romanticized today. People imagine noble knights in shining armor, ladies in elegant gowns, bustling marketplaces with colorful stalls, and kings ruling from grand stone castles. Popular culture paints the medieval period as a time of chivalry, feasts, and epic quests, as though every man was a brave warrior and every woman a fair maiden awaiting rescue. But peel back the curtain of myth and storybook charm, and you find a world that was, for most people, harsh, dirty, and unforgiving. If you were alive during the medieval centuries, chances are you were not a knight, a king, or even a wealthy merchant. You were more likely a peasant, a farmer toiling endlessly on land you didn't own, eating coarse bread and thin soup, and praying that sickness or famine did not strike your village. In short, living in medieval times was, for the overwhelming majority, an unrelenting struggle. The first thing one must understand about medieval life is that survival was never guaranteed. The average lifespan was shockingly low compared to modern standards, hovering somewhere between 30 and 40 years, though this number is skewed by the fact that infant mortality was catastrophically high. Many children never saw their 5th birthday, often succumbing to disease, malnutrition, or accidents. If you managed to reach adulthood, you had already beaten the odds, but the world still offered endless opportunities to meet an early grave. Plague, war, famine, and childbirth all stalked the people of this era. And while we often view history through the lens of kings and nobles, the vast majority of the population lived lives that were short, hard, and largely forgotten. Let's start with daily existence, because for most people, the routines of medieval life were grueling in their monotony. Imagine being born into a small wooden hut, one room shared by your entire family. The floor was dirt, often littered with straw and waste, and in the winter, animals might even share the same space, their body heat serving as crude insulation. There were no chimneys in the early centuries, so smoke from the fire filled the house, leaving the air choking and acrid. Windows, if they existed at all, were tiny slits covered with cloth or thin parchment, allowing little light to enter. Furniture was sparse, perhaps a bench, a table, and crude bedding stuffed with straw. Privacy was non-existent. Your parents, siblings, and possibly grandparents all lived under the same roof, and you grew accustomed to the smells of sweat, smoke, and rot. Food was another reminder that life in medieval times was far less romantic than modern fantasies suggest. A medieval peasant's diet was dominated by bread, coarse loaves made from barley, rye, or oats, often hard enough to chip a tooth. Alongside this was pottage, a kind of watery stew made from whatever vegetables could be grown or foraged. Meat was a rare luxury, usually reserved for the nobility or consumed only on festival days. For protein, peasants might rely on beans, lentils, or the occasional scraps of salted fish. Hunger was a constant threat, and a bad harvest could lead to famine that killed thousands. The Great Famine of the early 14th century, for example, devastated much of Europe, leaving people so desperate that chroniclers described parents abandoning children, and some rumors even whispered of cannibalism. To make matters worse, food preservation was poor, so meals often tasted rancid or spoiled. Drinking water could be contaminated, leading many to consume weak ale, but even that carried its risks. Then there was hygiene, or more accurately, the lack of it. Bathing was not an everyday affair for medieval people. For peasants, access to clean water was limited, and soap was a luxury. People might rinse occasionally in rivers or streams, but these same waters were also used for washing clothes, dumping waste, and watering animals. In towns, chamber pots were emptied into the streets, leading to the familiar cry of "Garde l'eau," as waste splashed onto the cobblestones below. Rats thrived in such environments, and fleas carried disease that would later ravage the population. Teeth rotted quickly, and medical knowledge of dentistry was non-existent. Bad breath, lice, and skin infections were part of everyday life. To walk through a medieval town was to inhale a mixture of smoke, animal dung, human waste, and the scent of tanneries or butchers at work. No wonder death and sickness were so common. Speaking of sickness, medicine in the Middle Ages was both primitive and terrifying. Illness was often attributed to imbalances of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, a theory inherited from ancient Greek physicians like Galen. Treatments included bloodletting, where leeches or knives were used to drain patients in the belief that removing blood would restore balance. Other remedies involved bizarre concoctions of herbs, animal parts, and minerals, many of which were more harmful than helpful. Surgeons, when they existed, performed their work without anesthesia or knowledge of infection. Amputations were done with saws and knives, and patients either survived through sheer willpower or died quickly of shock and sepsis. The spread of diseases like leprosy and, most infamously, the bubonic plague, underscored just how powerless medieval society was in the face of illness. The Black Death, which struck in the mid-14th century, remains one of the starkest reminders of how brutal medieval life could be. Sweeping through Europe, it killed anywhere from a third to half of the population, leaving entire villages abandoned. Doctors, clad in their eerie beaked masks, stuffed herbs into the beak to ward off what they believed were poisonous miasmas. But their efforts were futile. Corpses piled in the streets, and mass graves were dug to handle the sheer number of dead. The horror of the plague reshaped medieval society, but for those who lived through it, the experience must have been apocalyptic. It is difficult to imagine a world where every neighbor, friend, or family member might die within days of each other, but that was the grim reality of the time. Beyond disease, the rigid social structure of feudalism made life nearly unbearable for peasants. Society was organized like a pyramid, with the king at the top, followed by nobles, knights, and finally the peasants, who formed the majority. Serfs, bound to the land, had little to no freedom. They could not leave the estate without permission, owed heavy taxes and labor to their lords, and were subject to harsh punishments if they disobeyed. The idea of social mobility was nearly non-existent. If you were born a peasant, you would die a peasant. Education was rare, with literacy reserved mostly for clergy and the wealthy. Dreams of a better life were often nothing more than fantasies, crushed by the realities of survival and subservience. The work itself was grueling. Farming with primitive tools meant endless hours of backbreaking labor, plowing fields, sowing seeds, and harvesting crops. Weather was unpredictable, and a single storm or drought could destroy months of effort. Winters were especially cruel, with food supplies running low and little to shield families from the cold. Even children were expected to work from a young age, herding animals, gathering firewood, or assisting in the fields. Leisure was virtually non-existent, and any time spent away from work was often dedicated to religious obligations or village duties. Compared to the comforts of modern life, the medieval peasant's existence was little more than survival. War added another layer of misery to medieval living. While knights are often glorified in tales of valor, the reality of medieval warfare was devastating for ordinary people. Armies marched across the countryside, pillaging villages, burning crops, and slaughtering civilians. Raiders showed little mercy, and castles offered protection only for the wealthy and their retainers. Sieges were particularly horrific, as defenders starved within the walls while attackers cut off supplies. Weapons like the longbow, the crossbow, and eventually gunpowder artillery turned battlefields into slaughterhouses. For peasants caught in the middle, war meant displacement, hunger, and death. Religion was another powerful force that shaped medieval life, and though it offered comfort, it also imposed fear and restriction. The church dominated nearly every aspect of existence from birth to death. People were taught that the world was a temporary stop on the way to heaven or hell, and sin lurked around every corner. Superstition thrived, with witches, demons, and curses blamed for misfortune. The Inquisition, with its interrogations and tortures, revealed the darker side of religious authority. Heresy could be punished by burning at the stake, while accusations of witchcraft could doom innocent people. The church also demanded tithes, a portion of income that added to the burdens of peasants already struggling to survive. For women, life in the Middle Ages carried its own particular set of hardships. Most were married off young, sometimes as early as 12 or 13, and had little say in their futures. Childbirth was perilous, with high rates of maternal and infant mortality. Women were expected to be obedient wives and mothers, their roles confined to the household and fields. Those who stepped outside these boundaries faced suspicion and scorn. Noble women might enjoy some privileges, but even they were subject to arranged marriages and political alliances. Few paths existed for independence, and those who pursued them, such as joining a convent, still lived under strict rules. Children too faced a bleak reality. Childhood as we know it today, a time of innocence and play, barely existed. From the moment they could walk, children were expected to contribute to the household, whether by working in the fields, tending animals, or assisting in crafts. Education was rare, especially outside of monasteries or wealthy households. Many children never lived long enough to grow up, falling victim to disease, malnutrition, or accidents. Those who survived matured quickly, for life allowed little room for indulgence. Travel, though romanticized in tales of knights and pilgrims, was dangerous and exhausting. Roads were little more than muddy tracks, often plagued by bandits. Inns were dirty, food along the way scarce, and weather could turn a journey deadly. Pilgrimages to holy sites were undertaken with devotion, but the risks were great. Only the wealthy could afford to travel in relative safety, while common people had little reason or opportunity to leave their villages. For most, the world beyond their immediate surroundings was a mystery, and they lived and died within a radius of a few miles. So why, then, do people today continue to romanticize medieval times? Part of it lies in the allure of castles, knights, and epic tales of heroism. Literature and film often emphasize the grandeur of courtly life, the spectacle of tournaments, and the charm of simple living. But these portrayals ignore the suffering of the majority. Yes, kings feasted in great halls and knights jousted for glory, but behind those stone walls were countless peasants struggling to survive another winter, another harvest, another plague. The glittering image of the Middle Ages is largely a myth, a selective memory that erases the filth, hunger, and misery of everyday life. Why it sucked living in medieval times, Part 2. One of the most dreadful aspects of medieval life was the justice system, if it can even be called that. Law and order existed, but not in any form we would consider fair. For peasants, justice was arbitrary, often dictated by the whims of local lords. Trials by ordeal were common in earlier centuries. A person accused of a crime might be forced to plunge their hand into boiling water, or carry a red-hot iron for several paces. If the wound healed cleanly, God was believed to have intervened in their favor, and they were declared innocent. If it festered, which, given the lack of hygiene, it almost always did, they were guilty. Others were thrown into rivers or ponds in the infamous trial by water. If they floated, it was assumed that the water, being pure, had rejected them, proof of guilt. If they sank, they were considered innocent, though by then they were usually dead. Justice, in short, was as cruel and unreliable as the weather. Punishments themselves were designed not only to correct behavior but to terrify the public. Thieves might have their hands cut off. Petty criminals could be flogged or placed in the stocks, where they were humiliated for hours or even days as villagers pelted them with filth. More serious crimes warranted brutal executions: hanging, beheading, or burning at the stake. Hanging was often botched, with victims slowly strangling rather than dying instantly. Burning was excruciating and was sometimes carried out for heretics or supposed witches. The gallows were public spectacles, reminders to everyone of the consequences of defiance. It was not simply about punishment but about maintaining the rigid order of society, keeping peasants fearful and obedient. And yet, despite such punishments, crime thrived. In towns, pickpockets and cut purses operated in crowded markets. Bandits roamed the countryside, preying on travelers. Even nobles were hardly above lawlessness, engaging in feuds, raids, and outright theft from rivals. For the poor, crime was often born of desperation, stealing food to survive or poaching game from the lord's forest, an act that could bring harsh retribution. Life was not only unfair but dangerously precarious. At any moment, a mistake, a false accusation, or simply bad luck could lead to disaster. The mental world of the medieval person was shaped by fear and superstition. With science in its infancy, explanations for natural events were often fantastical. Lightning and storms were signs of divine wrath. Illness might be blamed on curses, demons, or witchcraft. Misfortunes like failed crops or miscarriages were sometimes attributed to neighbors who were accused of malice, giving rise to witch hunts long before the infamous trials of early modern Europe. Dreams, omens, and relics were invested with deep meaning, guiding decisions large and small. For a peasant who lacked education and was bombarded by sermons warning of eternal damnation, the supernatural felt as real and pressing as the material world. The church held a near monopoly on knowledge, and while it offered some solace through rituals and prayers, it also instilled relentless guilt and anxiety. Confession was required, penances were demanded, and indulgences could be purchased to reduce time in purgatory. The idea that every thought, every action, could tip the scales toward eternal torment meant that daily life carried an additional weight of fear. For many, the promise of heaven was the only comfort against the suffering of earth, but even that comfort was tempered by the constant reminder of hellfire. Seasonal rhythms also underscored just how fragile life was. Summer brought long days of toil, but also the chance to stockpile food for the winter. Autumn meant harvest, a back-breaking race against time to gather what the fields had produced. Winter was the cruelest season, bitter cold, dwindling supplies, and the threat of illness. Spring offered renewal but also the risk of floods or late frosts destroying seedlings. Unlike today, where food arrives at supermarkets regardless of the weather, medieval people lived and died by the success of the land. A few weeks of bad weather could spell hunger. A season of crop failure could bring famine. Famines were especially devastating. In times of shortage, people turned to desperate measures. They ground acorns into flour, ate bark or weeds, or slaughtered animals that were essential to farming. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making diseases spread even more quickly. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, chroniclers recorded scenes of people boiling leather for food, selling children, and even rumors of cannibalism. Whole villages disappeared, abandoned by survivors in search of sustenance. To live through a famine was to experience not just hunger but the collapse of one's world, as neighbors died and communities fractured under the strain. Yet for all this misery there were moments of reprieve. Festivals and fairs provided rare opportunities for celebration. On feast days work might stop, music might be played and games enjoyed. Traveling entertainers, known as minstrels or jongler, brought stories, songs and laughter to villages otherwise starved of distraction. But even these moments were fleeting. Fairs were also rife with thieves, disease could spread in crowded gatherings, and poor peasants could rarely afford the indulgences on display. For most, fun was little more than a brief pause between endless cycles of labor and suffering. The contrast between the lives of the nobility and those of peasants was stark. Castles might seem romantic to us, but they were cold, drafty fortresses more than luxurious homes. Fires provided limited warmth, and smoke often filled the halls. Nobles had better food and clothing, but they also faced the constant threat of betrayal, assassination, or war. A noblewoman might have fine dresses and servants, but she was still subject to arranged marriages and political maneuvering. And knights, while glamorized in legend, lived violent lives, often fighting in brutal wars or serving as enforcers for their lords. If anything, the glitter of noble life masked its own dangers. The peasants, at least, had anonymity. Nobles lived in a world where power was constantly contested, and death could come not only from disease but from the dagger of a rival. Still, for the ordinary peasant, life was so harsh that the nobility's problems seemed almost enviable. Toiling endlessly in fields, paying crushing taxes, obeying every command of their lord, peasants existed at the mercy of forces beyond their control. Their bodies wore down quickly, their teeth rotted, their backs bent from labor. They rarely traveled, rarely learned to read, and rarely had any chance to escape the circumstances of their birth. It was a world of stagnation, where the horizon of possibility extended only as far as the village church spire. Entertainment, when it existed, was often brutal by modern standards. Animal baiting, setting dogs on bears or bulls, was a common spectacle. Public executions were treated as community events, drawing crowds who jeered or cheered as criminals met grisly ends. Stories and songs often centered on violence, heroism, and the capriciousness of fate. Life was so saturated with suffering that even leisure reflected it. There was little space for the kind of comfort or creativity we associate with modern pastimes. And yet, people endured. They found ways to laugh, to celebrate, to believe. Perhaps that is the most remarkable fact about medieval life. Not that it was miserable, but that humanity survived it at all. Communities supported one another, families clung together, and religion, despite its fears, offered hope. But to imagine that life was easy, noble, or romantic is to ignore the constant undercurrent of hardship that defined the era. The castles and cathedrals we admire today were built on the backs of countless laborers who lived and died in obscurity. The tales of knights and maidens obscure the reality of peasants and serfs whose stories went untold. When modern people fantasize about living in medieval times, they rarely imagine themselves as serfs breaking their backs in a muddy field or as women facing childbirth without medical aid. They imagine banquets, tournaments, and castles. But statistically, they would have been among the poor majority, struggling daily just to survive. Romanticizing the Middle Ages is like imagining a life at sea as a captain of a grand ship while ignoring the sailors who were whipped, starved, and drowned. The fantasy appeals because it erases the suffering. The truth is far uglier. The Middle Ages eventually gave way to the Renaissance, an era that began to value humanism, science, and exploration. But that shift was slow, and for centuries life remained harsh. For every knight in shining armor, there were thousands of peasants covered in filth. For every great hall feast, there were villages scraping together meals of gruel. For every illuminated manuscript in a monastery, there were entire communities who could not read a single word. Progress was real but uneven, and for most of medieval history, daily existence was defined not by glory but by grit. In the end, what makes medieval life so difficult to imagine today is how little choice people had. We live in a world where, despite its flaws, individuals can often choose their paths, change their circumstances, and dream of something better. Medieval people were trapped by the rigid structures of their time, bound by feudal obligations, religious doctrines, and the limitations of technology. To live then was to accept a narrow life defined by forces far beyond your control. And for that reason, no matter how enchanting the myths may appear, it truly sucked living in medieval times.